business meeting. It says bus meeting, but it means business.
There's never
But you've got to remind
your FaceTime.
Oh, in Europe, I'm thinking, when I spell something wrong again.
Nope. The website looks nice too with all the stuff that is coming up.
Yeah,
It's
I
very
try to
nice.
get it updated as
It looks nice.
much as I can.
It looks nice.
So, yeah, we're glad to have you here tonight. Hey, we'll be able to adjourn tonight. That's good.
Just let me know how many I need to adjourn for.
Appreciate that.
So we haven't closed out the meeting.
Yeah, we're still open. That's the last time you were here. So, and,
That's funny.
got an interesting email Sunday afternoon from John Schneider, who was pastor here in the 80s. And he was going through some of his files, and he was pastoring here during the church's 150th anniversary. And he came across some documents, copies of documents that he had, that was written up by the pastor who was here in 1880, talking about the history of the church. So he sent me a PDF file, and then he told me he put one in the mail too. So I told him, I said, man, thank you for sending this. It's some interesting reading. When you find out when Michael Frederick came from the Bridgeton Baptist Church, which is now, of course, First Baptist Church of Bridgeton, he was not well welcomed in Cedarville. The main denomination in Cedarville did not want a Baptist denomination in Cedarville. And what I didn't realize, but from reading this document, was that the Dividing Creek Baptist Church actually tried to start a work in Cedarville and were run out by that denomination. And so Michael Frederick came in, he stood his ground, and then in September 8th, 1836, I think it was 33 souls started. And you look at the names, there's Bateman, there's Lummis, there's Shepherd, there's Davis. And so you see some of those family names still reside in Lawrence Town. Wouldn't have been Lawrence Township then. I don't know whether you realize that. We were part of Fairfield Township, and they divided that at some point, and we became Lawrence Township. But interesting reading, and I told him, I said, thank you so much for passing that along. And he said, yeah, I came across it. He said, I'm sure you must have copies of this somewhere. I said, yeah, I'm sure we do. But I was glad. But this was written and signed by the pastor, and I forget now, his name eludes me, who was pastor here in 1880. And as he was recounting the history of the church. And so it's just a remarkable thing when you get a chance to look at some of those things. And I know when we did our 175th, was it, that we had? Yeah, yes. We had the open house, and we had as much of that stuff displayed. Much of the community came in. I was so thankful for that. That was on a Tuesday, was the actual anniversary date, and so we had the church open on that Tuesday night. Many folks from the community came in to see much of the stuff, and so yeah, it was good to hear from him. I was glad to connect with him, and glad he was thoughtful to send that our way. All right, well, we go to Genesis chapter 1. We're going to start to move a little bit quicker now. I know it's taken 4 weeks to get through the first 2 verses, but now we will pick up some speed. As you'll see from your notes, hopefully we'll cover verses 1 through 23 now. And as we move into the days of creation, tonight we will only go through day 5. That's the reason for that, because day 6 is kind of special. And then we'll talk more about day 7 next week as well. But we want to just lay some groundwork and some thoughts as we start to move forward. We've been dealing with the subject of creation and origins as it relates to the thought of creation as the Bible defines it, and showing the counterpart to that in regards to theories like evolution. And even with the Christian community, last week we introduced that idea that some believe that there is this gap theory, that there was this gap somehow between verse 1 and verse 2, because it says that God created the heavens and the earth, but then the earth was void and without form, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the deep. and they were saying, well, there seems to be something happened there that maybe God had created the heavens and the earth, and something disrupted that, so now it is without form and it's void. And there's a lot of different speculation in regards to that. Probably the most common one that causes Christians to believe that that exists is related to the fall of Satan, but it's a very weak argument. And again, what sealed it for me was one of the commentaries that I read, and I've read a lot of them, is the fact of the matter is, and we were talking last week about geology. We talked about God in cosmology, we talked about God in a sense in astrology, but last week was about geology, and talking about the different rock layers and these different fossil layers. And again, even those folks that are not necessarily Christians or just geologists say that they cannot prove the transition even in the layers of fossils. They can find these different layers and these associated with different times, but not finding one transitioning from one layer to the other. In other words, that kind of that missing link. And so it just really doesn't exist. But it's the concept of these layers that they attribute to the fact that they claim that the earth is 4.5 billion years old. Of course, we explain that through the nature of the flood, because the flood would have created that compaction, that would have created those fossil layers as well. And I don't know if anybody, Cindy, did you look up that chart? It escapes me now. Lyle has that chart of the different layers I was talking about, and it's one of the most confusing things that you'd ever want to read in your life. But that's where he's the one, the Jurassic Age, the Mesozoic Age, and all these things, and showing down the one side where these layers exist, and then plugging them into what they call eons of time, and so forth. But the problem with that gap theory, even if Christians try to adapt that, and again, the phrase that solidified it for me was the fact that if that were the case, you would have to have death before the fall of man. You'd have to have death before sin in order to have those fossil records placed within the gap between verse 1 and verse 2. And so, and then it leads to something else we'll come back to tonight as well, the concept of theistic evolution, which again is, like a jumbo shrimp or military intelligence or, Microsoft Works. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. These oxymoron terms, this theistic evolution. And so I just do not accept that. Also tonight, I'll emphasize the fact that some believe that there was a gap between the end of Genesis chapter 1 and the beginning of Genesis chapter 2. Again, it's not necessary to do this. I think they're just overthinking the fact here. But it is against the first chapters of Genesis that I think that really Satan has launched his fiercest attacks. And I think that's where all these things really come from. And rightly so, because listen, if a person can't believe the first 2 chapters of Genesis, they're not going to believe the rest of Scripture either. They're going to find fault. They're going to find these, what they consider to be some sort of deficiencies in it. And if a person can believe by faith that God created the heavens and the earth, as we're told in Genesis chapter 1, then by faith we can believe in the last chapter of the Bible, Revelation, that he's going to create a new heaven and a new earth. And so Genesis provides the basis for such faith. And I just remind you that if Genesis chapter 1 is wrong, think about the implications. Then Jesus, who confirmed this record, and the prophets who declared this record, and the apostles who continued to teach this record, are nothing more than pathological liars. They propagated a lie, as well as our faith has become mere delusion. And so all that we believe really hangs on the balance of Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. And I think Satan knows that full well. And that's where you get these mirages. That's where you get these theories. And I always come back again to Romans chapter 1, where the idea that when they could know God, they chose not to retain God in their knowledge. So they're trying to find an alternative to in the beginning God. I think a lot of it falls back on the fact, too, that if they eliminate God from the equation, you also eliminate personal accountability. If there is no God, then I'm not accountable. If there's no one greater than myself, then I really don't have to give an account to anybody. And so we're going to see, however, in God's creation, there was, even from the very beginning of the design, not only, as we've emphasized, that this planet was created with the idea of human habitation. And the nature of what we would consider paradise, the world before the fall, before sin, we're going to see how God created that in such a marvelous way for human habitation. But within it is also built in the design, the ability for judgment and destruction. It exists. It exists in both of them. And so we'll see that as this unfolds. So in man's search for origins, or the world wants beginnings, and they search, but I believe we have found it in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning. There is the beginning, and it relates to God. Now, I want to back up and come to this idea just very quickly, talk about 3 reasons for the creation account. We talk about the human author of this. We understand it was Moses. And it's why would God see fit, to call Moses aside and say, hey, look, I'm going to tell you how we got here, where we came from, why we're here, and where we're going. Because he knew those would be the 3 greatest pressing questions that we would have to deal with. And I really think that we can answer the reason for creation in 3 aspects here. 3 reasons. First of all, remember, Moses is writing this, and so who's the first that's going to read it? The nation of Israel. And I think it's to encourage Israel's faith. As Greg has been leading us through the book of Joshua, a lot of what they're being called to do now is based on remembering what God had done in the past. And that means everything about being delivered from Egypt, being delivered in the matter of the Passover, in being delivered through the Red Sea, being provided for in the wilderness with the manna, with the water, even the deliverance of God's law. All those things. And then the establishment of that place of worship, the tabernacle, where the Shekinah glory would come. We can go back even further when God, if Moses delivers to them, here's the account of God says, this is how it all began. He told them to follow him, and God would come through for them. And so he had to be a powerful God in order to do these things. Moses declares his phenomenal omnipotence. God is powerful, and when you have that much power supporting you, that bolsters your faith, you see. I think it's also to refute the myths about the origins, because obviously, and again, we think Satan is behind that. As I said, theories are not new. We have the Babylonian creation aspects that have come down through the time. And you can read that in the time of the Israelites, there were also evolutionary theories. There were theories that man were fallen gods, that somehow God procreated and came up with humanity. And so there's all this perversion of this concept, you see. And there were myths then, and God wanted to set the record straight, so he refutes all the myth. And then thirdly, to paint a portrait of God, and I think it's the most important one, paint a portrait of God's character. That's one of the other questions. What is God like? Well, the only way you're going to know what God is like is to read what he has written. And so he reveals himself in the creation. Genesis 1 reveals God's sovereignty, his power, his relationship to mankind and the world. Genesis 1 refers to God no less than 32 times in just one chapter. And so it tells us something about who God is. Remember, in the beginning, God, it's that word Elohim, which represents his majesty, his power, his sovereignty in regards to his creative being. And so, with that in mind, as we go down through the rest of this chapter, we divide it into two sections, and we'll talk about the length of days of the creation account and the activity found in each day of the creation account. So first of all, we deal with the length of days in the creation account. In Genesis 1, we have to ask ourselves, does the length of days refer literally to a 24-hour solar day? And then, in all these events, do the days follow one after the other as a day follows night and night follows day? And why is it important to answer this question? Well, I'll tell you. It's because there are those who will still teach, and some, from a theological point of view, that they are not a literal solar 24-hour day, in order to do what? Again, create time in between each one. That's theistic evolution. They're trying to provide for that understanding of the evolutionary theory that given enough time, anything is possible. God doesn't need that time. He does not need that time. And so we need to stop accommodating that type of thinking. So the theorist would suggest that it's not to be taken literally. And how they do that, they say, well, the word day can mean age. And then they'll stretch it and say eon, and they can go from millions to billions of years, meaning that it does not refer to a 24-hour day. And there are many in churches, by the way, who preach that it is possible to have one foot in Genesis and another foot in evolution, as we've already seen from the gap theory, and now they're even trying to interject these gaps in between the given days of creation. So, theistic evolution really is defined simply as the belief that God began, and then, over the process of millions of years, things would evolve. He would begin this theoretical day, and then give it a million or a billion years to evolve, and then day 2, give it another million or billion years to evolve. God's not confined to that by any means. And so it's important that we understand whether the creation account day means 24-hour day or millions of years for each day, which would allow evolution of all that is recorded in Genesis chapter 1. Now let me give you 3 proofs for a literal interpretation. All right, build my case here. 3 reasons why I believe in a literal 24-hour day. And I might add again, these days are without gaps. Number 1, each day has an evening and a morning, right? When you look at verse 5 or you look at verse 8, the latter part of it, he concludes with the same statement, and there was evening and there was morning one day. And in verse 8, and there was evening and there was morning a second day. This is a common Hebrew phraseology for a literal solar day. That's how it was written. It is even foolish that we would even take the time to declare such obvious truth, but it seems sometimes the obvious is what runs by people the most, right? They just, they don't want to be, I've had my dad quote this back to me. Don't be confused. People don't like to be confused with the facts because they've made up their mind. And by whatever observation. So we take God at His word that this is, an evening, and it was a morning, and it was a day. Each day, of course, accompanied by a number. There was evening and there was morning, and then it's accompanied by the number of the day, in this case, the second day or the first day. At any time, and every time we read the word day, it is the Hebrew word yom, Y-O-Y-O-M, yom, and it is accompanied by a numerical adjective, and it always refers to a literal day, never a figurative day. And then God summarizes all the acts of creation. Notice the way that God summarizes the act. If you're there in Genesis 1, turn over to Genesis 2 for just a moment. And this is why, again, the mistake of injecting a gap between Genesis 1 and 1:2 is this idea that there must have been a gap. No, it just is a statement that God created the heavens and the earth, and then from that foundation, verse 2 begins to say, okay, here's how God did it. In the same way as Genesis 1 ends and Genesis 2 begins, we see in Genesis 2:1, thus the heavens and the earth were completed and all their host. By the seventh day, God completed his work in which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. So, no real gap there. He's just, again, he's summarizing now what he has said through the length of the first chapter. And as a matter of fact, you probably didn't realize this, but there is proof of creation as it relates to the Ten Commandments. You need to turn to it or just write it down. It's Exodus chapter 20. In Exodus chapter 20, beginning in verse 9, as God is delivering the law to Moses, it says, 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your sons or your daughters, your male or your female servants, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. Listen, verse 11, Exodus 20:11. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Now, does that sound like he's talking about millions and millions of years? No. What would they have understood it? They would have understood it as a literal 24-hour day. Because in the commandment, it's talking about the rest of the seventh day, a 24-hour day. Now, for the Jew, that meant from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. They do that a little different than we do. But still, a 24-hour day. And so, this is conclusive and comprehensive. God did everything he did in 6 literal days. And it's clear. Now, with that in mind, let's move into the activity of each day in the creation account. So back to Genesis chapter 1. And day 1, we look at first 5 verses. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was on the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and in the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning one day. Now let me suggest 3 things that happened when God created light. Number 1, this was not bodies that would either give off light or reflect light, because we'll see later the creation of the sun and the moon and the stars. This is simply light. The Bible tells us that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. But in this planet, he will separate and give understanding between those 2 things. God divided, number 2, the light from the darkness. He drew the boundaries and divided light from darkness. And then, of course, thirdly, God named the light day and the darkness night. I couldn't help but notice as I read this that God not only created objects, things, and creations and mankind, but do you realize he really created for us a vocabulary? Because where did we get the concept in mankind for the origin of words? You know, like we say, oh, it was a beautiful day today. Tomorrow is Monday morning. Or is it dark yet? Or what are we having for supper this evening? We have ingrained in us this concept of a day and a night. In this chapter, words were created such as light, darkness, day, evening, morning, water, heavens, dry land, sea, earth, vegetation, seas, trees, plants, fruits, and cattle. Did they exist before that? No. And so there's a whole vocabulary that, whether you believe in the creation account or not, that surrounds this language. And so everyone in this world borrows heavily from the Genesis account. Secondly, we have day 2, verses 6 through 8. Then God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, or maybe your text says a firmament. And let it separate the waters from the waters. God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below, the expanse from the waters which were above, and the expanse, and it was so. God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning a second day. Now, this expanse, from this we kind of conclude that as he created the world, it was in fact surrounded by water, because in a moment we're going to see that God does then separate the earthly waters from the land to create dry land. But to this point we're talking about two bodies of water. We're talking about earthly water, we're talking about heavenly water. This firmament, this expanse. And so there's water below and there is water above. And this is what's interesting, because this allows for two things that we often don't think about. First of all, what this does by having this firmament, by having this expanse, and we talk about that heaven, we understand the nature of that word heaven. The Apostle Paul talks about being called up into the third heaven, where is the presence of God. When we talk about then the first heaven, which is this is talking about that, and the firmament is really that place, that atmosphere that we understand. The second heaven would be that interstellar heaven that we often refer to. So you have water below and you have water above, and this allows for two things, hidden things that God created as well. God created the conditions, number one, for paradise. This canopy of water kept the harmful rays of the sun away. We're talking about paradise, remember? Now, if it were me, God would have had done something for me, because if He created me, put me in paradise, and I didn't have any clothes, I'd be burned up in 3 days. I wouldn't be able to handle the sun. There's just no way. Yeah, no. Adam and Eve didn't have any clothes, but they didn't get sunburned. Well, they were Middle Eastern. Well, I guess they weren't Middle Eastern. Yeah. So, but think about this. They didn't have to worry about it being too cold. They didn't have to worry about it being too warm. Well, wouldn't that be pleasant? Just this even temperature all the time. Just
Hawaii.
In Hawaii, yeah. You just don't really have to think about any of that. And that's really what this firmament, this expanse created in paradise. This ideal living condition. And so, yeah, that's paradise, man. And one day will be paradise again. But these are the conditions for paradise. But within that, here's the thing we tend to overlook. Within that condition for paradise, God also created the potential for judgment. Because with man's rebellion reached its horrible climax, what did God tell Noah to do? He told him to build an ark, because he was going to flood the earth. Now this is, of course, after the dry land has appeared and mankind has flourished. But where's God going to get all this water? That's a lot of water. Because the Bible tells us in Genesis 7:20 that the water was going to cover the face of the earth to 15 cubits, that's 22.5 feet above the highest mountain. That's a lot of water. There's water on the earth, but how do you make the most of that, right? Well, in Genesis chapter 7, as I just mentioned, listen to what he says. Genesis 7, beginning verse 10, it says, "It came about after the 7 days that the water," he's talking about Noah, "the waters of the flood came upon the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day," listen, "all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates." What are these floodgates? They're most often interpreted as windows of heaven. "And the sky was open, and the rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. Now that's a lot of water. Now understand something. It had not rained before this time. So this water falling from the sky, where did it come from? The expanse. This canopy, this firmament. Because after the flood, that's no longer there. That's not the ozone, by the way. That's a whole different situation. But this canopy is no longer there. And that's probably what contributed to men not living as long. Well, sin had a lot to do with it. But, as far as the length of his age, because, let's face it, before that, people were living 800-900 years old and everything. After the flood, he says your days are going to be shortened. Well, I think part of that is because that firmament, that expanse is gone. But there was a lot of water available in that expanse. I mean, to be able to rain for 40 days and 40 nights. I mean, we've had a lot of rain at times, but not for 40 days and 40 nights. You got to figure, where are you going to get that water from? Well, it was already there. The same water that was reserved to create paradise was the same water that was reserved that God was able to use for judgment. You say, well, he knew? Well, yeah, he knew. He's omnipotent. He knows everything. So, yeah, he knew. And so he created the planet with the ability to produce and provide environment, but also to destroy it. We already talked about this, and I think last week we looked at it in 2 Peter chapter 3, where Peter talks about the same pattern of judgment, little different means, but same pattern, when he says, knowing this, first of all, that in the last days mockers will come, and with mocking follow after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation, which is a misunderstanding. He says, Peter says, for when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed by being flooded with water. He says, you think everything's just like it's been from the beginning? No, it's not. The expanse is gone. A fossil record was created because of this worldwide flood. No, things are not the way they've always been. But he doesn't end there. He says in verse 7, but by his word the present heavens and earth are being reserved for fire, kept for the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men. Now, how's he going to do that? I had never thought about this before, but I read this past week. We talk about water, right? 74% of the earth is covered in water. 74%. What is the element of water? H2O. That means one part hydrogen, one molecule.
Two hydrogens.
Yeah, I've got it backwards here. I've got to read what I've read. Simple molecule, one of water, two of hydrogen, because that's important. One of water, two of hydrogen. Now, what if God decides, like he dropped the canopy down, what if he just, 74% of the world, he just takes that water and he just goes ahead and separates it to nothing but hydrogen?
Boom.
Yeah, this place is a bomb. The smallest spark, and this place is burnt up. I mean, worldwide. So it's there. It is there. I think about the words of Colossians 1:17 talks about Jesus Christ. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. All he's got to do is let go. And there it goes. And so there's a pattern there. There is a pattern there. All right, well, we'll move to day 3. Day 3, verses 9 through 13. And God said, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so, and God called the dry land earth, and he gathered the gathering of the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit, trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind with seeds in them. And it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. Now, there's 2 key phrases in those verses right there. First key phrase is bearing fruit. Bearing fruit. We've already mentioned this, that God created the world with a sense of maturity. Again, he didn't create, Adam and Eve were not babies, they were full grown. And so when he created this vegetation and the fruit and all that stuff, it clearly says bearing fruit. You know, he didn't invent the apple seed and then waited for, you know, Adam and Eve would have started that by the time they had, well, maybe it'd been better if they didn't have an apple, but anyway. But it was the idea, it was a tree already bearing fruit. It's already mature and bearing fruit. When God created anything on the planet, he created it already mature. From Adam and Eve to everything, from the animals, everything was in a state of maturity. The second important phrase is not only bearing fruit, saying that it has that aspect of maturing, but here's the thing that flies in the face of the evolutionist. After their kind. After their kind. So if you have a peach tree, you expect to get peaches. You have a pear tree, you expect to get pears. That's the way it works, you see. The word kind is the word phylum, which means a direct line of descent within a group. You see, that's important. Because the evolutionist is trying to say, well, no, man evolves from one lower form to a higher form. Starts out, you know, some sort of amoeba or something like that, becomes, you know, this tadpole, then he loses his tail and he jumps on the land, and next thing you know, he's swinging from a tree, and then he's serving in Congress. But anyway, I should have said that. But nonetheless, no, I'll be glad to be done with this whole thing. People need to be in church. You want to hear me show up? Threaten me in person. Hey, you know, I didn't get caught up in it, but man, people are just coming unglued. Just absolutely unglued. I thought I was coming unglued, but I'm not even close. It's good news for a lot of people, but I just, my cable bill was just driving me crazy. And when I went and talked to him about it last week, I went back and talked again this week. It had gone up $20 in the time I went. I'm thinking, listen, what's it? I better do something now, because if I come back at the end of the month, I may have to take out a loan. So it's funny, I went back in and I got the same young lady that I got a week ago. She said, "I waited on you." I said, "Yeah." I said, "I'm back. We're going to make some changes here. We're going to dial some things back here." So I'm spending money that's just I don't need. And about that time, and this little girl, she probably didn't weigh 80 pounds. You know, and this fella came through the door, and you could look on his face and you think, this guy's not right. And he had a box under one hand, he had like a remote and some cables under the other hand, and he just went, I got hung up on twice by you people, and then it's, man, and then he's cussing out. And this little young lady, she looks across, she says, "Push the button." I'm thinking, what's the button? I don't know. But she confronts this guy. "You're not going to come in here and cuss at us." And I'm thinking, good grief, man. About that time, a guy that was, 3 times her weight and twice her height went over there to back her up. But they threw him out. And just before they threw him out, he took his stuff, and you know how they have the displays in the center? He threw his stuff at the displays. Well, I guess after they threw him out, he decided he needed that stuff back. So he came in, and he did it. Because thinking about paying for it, I might as well go home and watch it, I guess. I don't know, but that's look, they threw him out 3 times, and I don't know what the button was. I'm thinking, when are the cops going to get here? If not, I'm sticking with her, because I'm sure she can handle anybody. But, I'm thinking, everybody's on the edge, man. They're just, this guy having a very bad day. And I'm thinking, these aren't the people that hung up. I don't think these are the people that hung up on you. I don't know. But it's really not worth losing your mind over. So what was my point down that story? There was a point for it, but that was an experience. Man, I'm telling you what, things just going apart at the seams. But this idea that there are no, we've already said, even in the fossil records, there are no transitional forms. There is nothing that shows that that's happening. And so this idea of after their kind. I mean, you understand that. You got to Lancaster, right? You see people who have, they have donkeys and they have horses, and they breed them together. You get a mule. You know, a mule is sterile. It can't reproduce. It's end of the line, man. That's it. And we have different species of animals. I mean, according to the dog food commercials, your dog wants to be a wolf. Let's hope that doesn't happen while you're sleeping, or he doesn't turn into a coyote, or something like that. And really, I don't have time to go into this now, but that explains. Ken Ham does a beautiful job of explaining that as in regards to people saying, "How can you get all these animals, these different species on the ark?" Well, if you reduce them down to the base species, before, it gets down to smaller numbers, but it's after their kind. And so that's bearing fruit, fully mature, and after their kind, meaning that there is this direct line of descent within fruit. Well, number 4 is day 4, verses 14 through 19. Then God said, "Let the lights in the expanse of the heaven to separate the day from the night, and then let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years, and let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. And I always like this. And he made the stars also. Like, I'll throw them in while I'm at it, no problem. And then God placed them in the expanse of the heaven and to give light on the earth, and to govern the day and the night, and separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, a 4th day. So, again, by talking about these particular lights, these planets, again, we talk about that circular reasoning of the geologist trying to date the Earth. How old's the Earth? Well, we can determine the age of the Earth by the age of the stars. Well, how old are the stars? By the age of the Earth. It's like, well, that doesn't really tell us anything. And so it just leaves too many holes. So again, I think, we have a young Earth in that regard. And, there's a couple lessons I think that we learn in regards to the light. I think one is that light gives a constant illustration to us. The Bible does say that Jesus Christ is the light of the world, but it also says that as Christians, we are reflective of that light. Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, it says, "Do all things without grumbling or disputing, so that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent children of God above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation." Listen, "among whom you appear as lights in the world." Now, that light is reflective light of Jesus Christ. And so, literally translated, reflected lights. And so it tells us something about that. And then it is also something about the future, because remember what it tells us in Revelation chapters 21 and 22, that in the new heaven and the new earth, there will be no need for the sun, because the Son of God is the light. He will illuminate all there. And there's no more night. There's no more night. And so what a difference that's going to make. And then day 5, verses 20 through 23, says, "Then God said, let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth. In the open expanse in the heavens, God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, and with which the waters swarmed after their kind." That's important again. "And every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good, and God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the waters in the seas. Let the birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening, and there was morning, a 5th day." And so again, we see this idea of creation. What do we find in that creation? We find them obedient to God. That's something we should pick up from that. The Bible tells us a little bit sometimes in our relationship to God. Remember in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6, that says, look at the bird, which is an illustration that God cares for us. He said, if he knows every sparrow, even the one that falls, he's got an eye on you, right? And Solomon tells us in the Proverbs to go to the animal kingdom and learn wisdom by their activity, about the industrial nature of the ant as he prepares for winter and all the rest. And then the book of Job. Listen to what Job writes in regards to this. In Job chapter 12, verse 7 through 10, it says, but now ask the beast, and let them teach you, and the birds of the heaven, and let them tell you. Oh, speak to the earth, and let it teach you, and let the fish in the sea declare to you. Whom among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this, in whose hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind? He said, you know what, if the animals could talk to you, they would tell you, God did this. God did this. And we ought to be able to look at them in just their design and believe that as well. John Wesley, writing of God's display of power in creation, said this. He said, God created the heavens and the earth, and he didn't even have to try. I mean, it was just that easy. I read that people of old used to write 3 words above their doorway in Latin. It was Nis Dominus Grustra, which means without God, frustration. I thought about writing that. Without God, frustration, right? This idea of trying to find an alternative to the creative account of God in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 just leaves man frustrated. Because I circle back again to the idea that those 3 gnawing questions that everybody has, whether they admit it or not, is where did I come from, why am I here, and where am I headed? And God answers all those things. And it begins in that aspect of creation. And the reason they're frustrated is because they're trying to do life without God. What a terrible thing. And what happens when you do life without God? You begin to devalue creation. You begin to devalue human life. Sad to say, you even can begin to devalue your own life. And what a tragic thing when that happens. When I was at the pastors' conference in Dallas, one of the preachers was pointing out the fact and asked the question about, he ministers primarily to teenagers, and and he was talking about asked the question about when teen suicide really began to rise. A lot of people thought it was during COVID. It wasn't. It started really in 2012, which is really the ground level of social media. And when it really started to take off to a point of where they were just ensconced in this thing. And but what happened was people felt that they didn't have value. They didn't have worth. They compared themselves to everybody and anybody. And if they don't have what you have, or they feel that they're lacking something that somebody else has and they can't achieve it, then they deem themselves as unworthy. No wonder man is frustrated. You learn value and worth when you discover by faith that you've been created by God, and that He created you with a purpose. And so I just want to finish with this application. The application is simple. If God is indeed our Creator, He has every right, every ability to be our Savior. And so, understand something. If we have a soul that needs saving, who better than the one who created us and knows us better than we know ourselves? God is your designer. Thank God He wants to be our Redeemer. And of course, as we get ready to celebrate Christmas here, that's what He did. He sent a Redeemer. And that promise came right after the fall of man. And I'll talk more about that Sunday morning as we talk about being in God's waiting room. And, so that's Sunday when we'll talk about that. All right, let's pray. Father, thank You for this time of study tonight. And God, we understand the element of faith. Without faith, it's impossible to please you. But God, it's not just blind faith. God, there's much for us to glean just by observing the very world in which we live in. And thinking rationally, as we've talked about. And God, seeing the things that are before us that reveal there had to be something much greater for these things to exist. And by faith we accept that in the beginning it was you, it was God that created the heavens and the earth and everything that would follow. God, thank you for what you've done. And even after sin left its mark, you sent us a Redeemer so that we might be reconciled to you once again. We thank you in Jesus' name. All right. Well, I don't even know if anybody's watching tonight or not. They could come up here as they did. And so, either way, my feet are cold. If you are watching, thanks.